Hey there. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to think about cities, and specifically about all the things that make a city work. Not in a stressful way, not as a list of problems to solve, but more like a slow walk backwards through time and through layers, gently peeling back one thing at a time to see what was underneath it. Cities are these incredibly complicated systems, and most of us move through them every day without thinking too much about how they hold together. So we're just going to take a quiet look at that, one layer at a time, very slowly, no rush at all. Get comfortable. Let's just ease into this together. Picture a city the way it looks right now. Not any specific city, just the general idea of one. There are buildings of varying heights arranged along streets. There are lights on in some of the windows, even late at night. Somewhere in the city there is a hospital with its lights always on. Somewhere there is a bakery getting ready for the morning shift, the oven's already warming up. Somewhere a train is running underground, carrying a handful of late-night passengers from one part of the city to another. The sound of it a kind of low hum that you feel more than hear if you are standing on the platform above. All of that is happening right now, in this moment, without anyone coordinating it in real time. Nobody is in a central room pushing buttons to make the bakery start its ovens, and the train run its next trip, and the hospital keep its lights on. It is all just running, quietly, on its own, because of a vast arrangement of systems that have been built up over a very long time, each one resting on another, each one assuming that the others are in place. And that is really what we are going to look at tonight. Not the drama of systems failing, not the tension of crisis, but the quieter question of what all of those layers actually are. What is it, exactly, that a city is made of when you really slow down and look? The most obvious layer, the one right at the surface, is what you see when you walk down any street in any large city. Buildings, shops, roads, parked cars and moving cars, people walking with purpose or without it, the physical stuff. And it all looks very solid, very permanent, as though it has always been there and will always be there. But even this top layer is more delicate than it looks. It is maintained by a continuous background effort that is almost invisible precisely because it is working. Somewhere in the city at this very moment there is a road crew fixing a pothole, or a building manager inspecting a roof, or a window washer on scaffolding doing the slow, methodical work of keeping glass clean. There is a crew replacing a section of sidewalk that had cracked badly enough to become a hazard. There is a team inside the walls of a building rerunning old electrical wiring that had started to fail. All of that maintenance work is so routine that most people in the city never think about it. The road is just there. The building is just there. The electricity just comes out of the socket when you plug something in. But there are people and organizations and schedules behind all of it, quietly doing the work to keep the surface layer looking the way it looks. If we step back a little further, we can ask what makes that maintenance work possible. And the answer, when you follow it, leads pretty quickly to a few things. It leads to money, in the form of city budgets and private building budgets. It leads to materials, in the form of asphalt and concrete and copper wire and glass. And it leads to knowledge, in the form of the accumulated expertise of engineers and electricians and construction workers who know how to do all of these specific jobs. The money side of it is interesting to sit with for a moment. Cities have budgets. Those budgets come primarily from taxes, which come from the economic activity that happens within the city. People work and earn money and pay taxes on their income. Businesses operate and earn revenue and pay taxes on that. Property is owned and property taxes are paid on that. All of that money flows into the city's budget, and from there it flows out to pay for the maintenance crews and the road repairs and the public buildings and the parks and everything else that a city manages on behalf of its residents. So the maintenance of the physical layer of a city is quietly dependent on the economic layer. And the economic layer is dependent on the city being a place where economic activity can happen, which requires the physical layer to be maintained. These two things hold each other up in a way that is so continuous and so interwoven that it is very easy to take for granted. The city works because it works, in a way, because all of the pieces are in place and reinforcing each other. If we step back a little further and ask what allows economic activity to happen in a city, we start to get into something genuinely interesting. There is a layer underneath the visible economic activity, a kind of infrastructure of trust and coordination that is just as important as the roads and buildings. Think about what happens when you walk into a store and buy something. You hand over money, or you tap a card, and you receive goods in exchange. That exchange works because both you and the person operating the store share a set of expectations. You expect that the thing you are buying is actually what it says it is. The store operator expects that the money you are handing over is real and that your bank account actually contains the funds it appears to contain. Both of you expect that if something goes wrong with the transaction, there are systems in place to address it. That shared set of expectations is not automatic. It is built on a foundation of laws and institutions and enforcement mechanisms and record-keeping systems that have been developed over a very long time. The money in your bank account is a number in a database somewhere, and you can trust that number because of an entire architecture of financial regulation and insurance and central banking that operates in the background to make that number meaningful. Before that was possible, things worked differently. The history of how we got to a world where a number in a database can be used to buy things is its own very long story, one that involves the development of paper money, and before that metal coins, and before that various kinds of commodity money, and before that pure barter and gift economies where exchange happened through personal relationships rather than abstract tokens of value. We do not need to go all the way back there tonight. But it is worth just noticing that the economic layer of a city rests on this quieter foundation of shared beliefs and institutional arrangements. Money works because people believe it works and because there are institutions backing up that belief. And those institutions, in turn, require the city to be functioning well enough to support them. If we take another step back, we find ourselves looking at the infrastructure that the economic and physical layers both depend on. And this is where things get interesting in a different way, because the infrastructure of a modern city is genuinely extraordinary when you stop to look at it. Water is one of the most basic pieces of it. In almost every modern city, you can turn on a tap and clean water comes out. That is so routine that it barely registers as remarkable. But the system behind it is anything but simple. There is a source, which might be a reservoir or a river intake or a series of wells. There are treatment facilities where the water is processed to remove contaminants and make it safe to drink. There are pipes, thousands of miles of them in a large city, running under the streets and through the walls of buildings, carrying that treated water to every faucet and toilet and dishwasher and fire hydrant in the city. And then there is the other side of it, the wastewater side. Every drop of water that goes down a drain has to go somewhere. There is an entirely separate network of pipes, also running under the streets, carrying wastewater away from buildings and toward treatment facilities where it is processed before being released back into the environment. The two systems, clean water in and wastewater out, have to be completely separate, because contamination of one by the other would be a serious public health problem. Maintaining these water systems is a continuous, largely invisible effort. The pipes age and corrode and occasionally fail. The treatment facilities require constant operation and skilled workers and chemicals and electricity. The pumping stations that move water through the system have to be running at all times, which means they need a power supply and backup power for when the primary supply fails. That word, electricity, is its own entire layer. The electrical grid that powers a modern city is one of the most complex systems ever built. It involves power generation at scale, which might come from burning fossil fuels or from nuclear reactions or from wind or from solar panels or from hydroelectric dams or from some combination of all of these. It involves high-voltage transmission lines that carry that power over long distances. It involves a network of substations that transform the voltage down to levels that can be used safely in homes and businesses. And it involves the final distribution network, the wires running under or over streets and into buildings, that delivers power to individual outlets and fixtures. The grid operates in real time. Generation has to match consumption, constantly. If too much power is being generated and not enough consumed, the frequency of the grid drifts in one direction. If too much is being consumed and not enough generated, it drifts the other way. Both are problems. The people who operate the grid have to continuously monitor it and adjust it to keep everything in balance. And they have to do this as demand shifts throughout the day and as individual generators go online or offline for maintenance. There is something almost meditative about that image. Somewhere in every city there is a control center where people are watching these numbers, watching the balance of the grid, making small adjustments, keeping everything steady. It is happening right now, while you are listening to this. The lights are on in the room where you are because those people are doing their job, and because a whole cascade of systems behind them are doing their jobs too. If we step back a little further and ask what makes the electrical grid possible, we find ourselves looking at several things. We find the engineering knowledge required to build and operate it. We find the materials, the copper and steel and glass and insulating polymers. We find the fuel or energy source, whatever is being burned or captured or split to generate the electricity in the first place. And we also find something that is easy to overlook, which is the manufacturing capacity required to produce the components of the grid. The transformers at substations are large, complex pieces of equipment. When one fails, it needs to be replaced. That replacement comes from a factory somewhere, which has its own supply chain of materials and components. The same is true for every other component of the grid. None of it can be improvised on the spot. All of it requires an industrial capacity that stretches far beyond the city itself. This is a pattern that repeats itself as you look at each layer of a city's infrastructure. Each layer depends not just on things within the city but on things that come from outside it. Food comes from farms that may be hundreds of miles away. Energy comes from sources that may be even further. Materials come from mines and forests and factories that are scattered across the continent or the world. The modern city is, in a very fundamental sense, a node in a global network. It cannot sustain itself in isolation. It depends continuously on flows of goods and energy and information coming in from outside. And the systems that manage those flows, the transportation networks and communication systems and supply chains, are layers of their own, each one built on other layers below it. Transportation is one of the most visible of these external-facing layers. A city is connected to the wider world by roads and railways and airports and, in some cases, waterways. Goods arrive by truck and train and ship. People arrive by plane and car and train. The city's ability to import what it needs and export what it produces depends on those connections being maintained and operational. Think about what moves through those connections on any given day. Food, obviously. Enormous quantities of it, from many different sources, arriving continuously so that the shelves in grocery stores and restaurants remain stocked. Also fuel, in the form of gasoline and diesel and natural gas, arriving by pipeline and tanker and truck. Also raw materials for manufacturing and construction. Also products of every kind, consumer goods and industrial equipment, and medical supplies and everything else that the city's residents and businesses use. The logistics of all of this, the coordination of what comes in when and where it goes once it arrives, is itself a vast and sophisticated system. There are warehouses and distribution centers on the edges of cities where goods are sorted and repackaged for final delivery. There are fleets of trucks running routes that are optimized to get things where they need to go efficiently. There are information systems tracking the location and status of shipments so that the whole thing can be managed in real time. All of that rests on the road network, which requires maintenance. It rests on the fuel supply, which requires its own supply chain. It rests on the vehicles themselves, which require manufacturing and maintenance. And it rests on the knowledge of how to operate and coordinate all of these systems, knowledge that lives inside organizations and in the training and experience of the people who work in them. Before that was possible in its current form, cities relied on different transportation networks. The railway was enormously important in the 19th century, transforming how cities could grow by allowing food and materials to be brought in from much further away than was practical by horse and wagon. And before the railway, cities were much more constrained in their size by what could be moved practically by water or by road with animal power. There is something interesting about sitting with that constraint for a moment. A city without reliable long-distance transportation has to be much more self-sufficient. It has to grow more of its own food nearby. It has to use materials that are available locally. It has to manage with whatever it can produce within a reasonable radius, because bringing things from far away is slow and expensive, and not something you can rely on for everyday necessities. The large modern city, with its millions of residents, and its towering skyline and its 24-hour activity, is only possible because transportation has become fast and reliable and cheap enough to sustain it. Strip that away, and the city would need to look very different, or it would need to shrink substantially. If we step back a little further, we come to another layer that is so fundamental and so pervasive that it is almost invisible. That is the layer of communication and information. A modern city runs on information. The electrical grid runs on information about how much power is being consumed and generated, so that it can be kept in balance. The water system runs on information about pressure and flow rates and chemical levels, so that it can be kept functioning safely. The transportation network runs on information about where trucks and trains are, and what they are carrying and where they need to go. Financial systems run almost entirely on information. The money in your bank account is information. The transaction that happens when you buy something is information moving from one place to another and causing numbers in databases to change. The entire global financial system is a system for managing and communicating information about who owns what and what is owed to whom. And at a more everyday level, the social coordination that allows a city to function is itself a form of information exchange. People need to know where to go and when to be there and what the rules are and what is happening. That knowledge gets distributed through signs and announcements and newspapers and broadcasts, and, in the modern city, through the internet and the smartphones that most people carry with them. The internet itself is a piece of physical infrastructure. It is a network of cables, both copper and fiber optic, running under streets and across ocean floors. It is a network of wireless transmitters and receivers providing Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity. It is a collection of data centers, buildings full of servers, where information is stored and processed. And it is a set of protocols, agreed upon rules for how information is formatted and transmitted, that allow all of these physical components to work together as a coherent system. That last piece, the protocols, is worth pausing on. The internet works because everyone who uses it agrees to use the same set of rules for how data is packaged and addressed and routed. Those rules were developed over time and adopted gradually, and they are maintained and updated by organizations that work out the details and achieve consensus. The physical cables and the servers matter, but so does this layer of agreed convention that makes them useful. Before the internet, cities relied on other communication systems. The telephone, which connected individual buildings directly. The telegraph before that, which allowed messages to be sent over long distances as electrical pulses. The postal system, which carried physical letters and packages along established routes. And before all of those, word of mouth and physical proximity, the need to be in the same place at the same time in order to exchange information. At an earlier stage, before reliable long-distance communication was possible, the amount of coordination that a city could sustain was much more limited. You could coordinate things that happened within a small enough area that you could physically walk to and talk to the people involved. Anything beyond that required going through intermediaries and accepting significant delays. The expansion of what cities could do and how complex their systems could become is closely linked to the expansion of their ability to communicate. As communication became faster and cheaper and more reliable, coordination could happen at larger scales, and the systems of a city could become more intricate and more interdependent. If we step back a little further and think about what underlies all of the communication systems, we find ourselves at another interesting layer. Communication requires not just the physical infrastructure but the shared knowledge of how to use it. People need to know how to write and read in order to use a postal system effectively. People need to know how to use the specific devices and applications in order to use the internet. More broadly, the operation of a modern city requires a population with a certain level of education and technical knowledge. The engineers who design and maintain the water treatment plants have to understand chemistry and fluid dynamics. The electricians who wire buildings and fix grid components have to understand electrical systems. The software developers who build the information systems that coordinate logistics and finance, and everything else have to understand programming and data structures and security. All of that knowledge lives in people, and it gets into people through education. Schools and universities and training programs and apprenticeships, the whole apparatus of education, is what reproduces knowledge across generations and makes it possible for cities to keep operating as the people who originally built their systems age and retire and are replaced by younger workers. Education, in this sense, is one of the deepest layers of what makes a city function. Not just because an educated population makes better decisions or is more innovative, though both of those things are true, but because without the transmission of technical knowledge, the systems that cities depend on would begin to degrade. Things would break and no one would know how to fix them. Equipment would reach the end of its life, and no one would know how to replace it. Procedures would be lost. Expertise would dissolve. There is something striking about that. All of the systems we have been talking about, the electrical grid and the water system and the transportation network and the communication infrastructure, all of them require not just the physical components to exist but the knowledge of how to operate and maintain and repair them to exist somewhere accessible. That knowledge is partly written down in manuals and textbooks and documentation, but a lot of it lives in people, in the accumulated experience of practitioners, in the tacit understanding that comes from years of doing a thing. Knowledge of this kind is surprisingly fragile. A gap in education, a period when fewer people are trained in a particular specialty, can create vulnerabilities that take time to recognize and longer to fix. The knowledge does not disappear suddenly, but it thins out, and the systems that depend on it become more brittle as a result. If we step back a little further, we find ourselves looking at the governance layer of a city. Governance might seem like an abstraction compared to water pipes and electrical cables, but it is, in its own way, just as fundamental to how a city holds together. Governance is the set of rules and institutions and decision-making processes that allow a large number of people to coordinate their behavior without constant conflict. Without governance, the various systems of a city could not be built or maintained, because they require cooperation among many different parties with potentially different interests. Think about what it takes to build a water treatment plant. The land has to be acquired. The plant has to be designed and built, using contractors and materials from many different sources. It has to be operated and maintained. The water it produces has to be distributed. The wastewater from across the city has to be collected and routed to it. All of that requires agreements and contracts and regulations and enforcement, the basic machinery of governance. Or think about the road network. Roads require land that has been legally designated for public use. They require funding from taxes, which requires a tax system and the authority to collect taxes and the enforcement to make sure people pay them. They require building codes and traffic laws and enforcement of those laws. All of that is governance, quietly underlying the physical thing that you see when you look at a road. Governance also sets the conditions under which economic activity happens. Property rights, the ability to own things and exclude others from using them, are a product of governance. Contract law, the ability to make binding agreements with other people and have those agreements enforced, is a product of governance. The financial regulations that make the banking system trustworthy are a product of governance. At an earlier stage, before formalized governance systems were in place, these things worked differently. Agreements were enforced by social pressure and reputation rather than by law. Property was controlled by power and custom rather than by formal title. Economic activity happened within a smaller circle of personal relationships, because those personal relationships were what made trust possible. As governance systems became more formalized and more reliable, they made possible larger-scale cooperation. They made it possible to enter into agreements with strangers, trusting that the agreement would be honored because the law provided a mechanism for enforcing it. They made it possible to invest in long-lived infrastructure, trusting that the rules would remain stable enough that the investment would pay off over time. The relationship between governance and the other systems of a city is a reciprocal one. Good governance enables the other systems to work well, and working systems provide the resources and capacity that allow governance to function. When governance is weak or unstable, the other systems tend to suffer. When the other systems are failing, they put pressure on governance to address the failures, which tests the capacity and legitimacy of governance institutions. This is another one of those circular dependencies that shows up everywhere when you look at how cities work. The pieces hold each other up, and the strength of the whole depends on the strength of all of them. Before that was possible in its current form, before the kind of formalized governance structures that most modern cities rely on, cities existed and functioned, but they were more constrained. The city-states of ancient Greece, the walled cities of medieval Europe, the imperial capitals of various ancient civilizations, all of them had governance structures of some kind. All of them had rules and institutions and enforcement mechanisms. But those structures looked quite different from the ones we have now, and they enabled different kinds and scales of activity. If we step back a little further, we come to something that underlies governance itself, which is the layer of social norms and shared values. Governance institutions are built on paper and given authority by law, but their actual function in the day-to-day life of a city depends on people generally behaving in accordance with them. Most people follow most rules most of the time not because they are being watched and would be punished if they didn't, but because they have internalized the idea that following rules is the right thing to do, or because they see others following rules and it seems normal to do the same, or because they understand that a world in which everyone follows the rules is a better world than one in which they don't. These shared understandings, these social norms, are what make a city livable at a scale that formal enforcement alone could not manage. There are simply too many interactions happening too constantly for all of them to be governed by explicit rules enforced by observers. The city works because people mostly cooperate, and they mostly cooperate because of a shared set of expectations about how people behave and what is and isn't acceptable. This layer of social norms is built up over time through shared experience and culture and education and the countless small interactions that make up daily life in a city. It is not fixed. It changes as circumstances change and as values evolve. But it provides a kind of stable background against which all of the more formal systems operate. At an earlier stage in the development of cities, social norms were doing even more of the work that formal systems do now. Before there were police and courts and prisons, communities maintained order through social pressure and reputation and the threat of exclusion. Before there were building codes and health regulations, communities developed informal standards for how buildings should be constructed and how waste should be managed, enforced by shared expectations rather than by law. The formalization of rules, the process of turning implicit social norms into explicit written law and creating institutions to enforce that law, was itself a process that happened gradually over a very long time. And it was a process that was driven in part by the growth of cities. As cities got larger and the population became more diverse, the shared understandings that worked well in small communities became less reliable. People who did not know each other could not rely on reputation and social pressure to enforce cooperation. Formal institutions filled that gap. If we step back a little further and ask what came before even the earliest forms of urban governance, we find ourselves thinking about the origins of cities themselves, which is a question that takes us deep into human history. The first cities emerged somewhere around 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, depending on how you define a city and where you are looking. Some of the earliest were in Mesopotamia, in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the conditions for dense settlement were particularly favorable. Others appeared roughly contemporaneously in the Nile Valley in Egypt, in the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan, and in somewhat different forms in other parts of the world. These early cities did not appear suddenly. They were the result of a gradual process of increasing settlement density, driven by a number of factors. Agriculture was one of the most important. The ability to grow food in one place and store it created both the possibility and the incentive for people to stay in one place rather than moving seasonally as hunter-gatherers did. And once people were staying in one place, and once they were producing a surplus of food that could support people doing things other than growing food, the conditions for a city began to take shape. But agriculture itself, the layer that made cities possible, rested on a very long period of accumulated knowledge about plants and animals and seasons and soils. That knowledge was developed over tens of thousands of years of human experience, observing the natural world, learning what grew where, learning how to encourage growth and manage water, learning how to store grain and manage livestock. None of it appeared suddenly. All of it was built up incrementally, transmitted across generations, gradually becoming the foundation on which everything else could be built. When we think about what a city is built on, all the way down, we eventually get to this: accumulated human knowledge and the ability to transmit that knowledge across generations. Language, which makes it possible to describe and explain and instruct and remember. The ability to record information, which extends the reach of knowledge beyond what any individual can remember, and beyond what can be transmitted by voice alone. The cultural and social structures that create continuity across generations, so that what was learned in one generation does not have to be discovered again from scratch in the next. These are, in a sense, the very deepest layers. Not pipes or cables or roads, but the capacity to know things and pass that knowledge on. Everything else is built on that. If we go back even further, we can ask what allows knowledge to accumulate and be transmitted at all. And we find ourselves thinking about language. Human language, as it exists, is genuinely remarkable. It is flexible and expressive in ways that allow very complex ideas to be communicated. It can describe things that are not present, things that happened in the past, things that might happen in the future, abstract concepts, hypothetical situations. All of that expressive power is what makes the accumulation of knowledge possible. Language itself rested on biological capacities that developed over a very long period of evolutionary time. The vocal apparatus capable of producing the range of sounds human language uses. The cognitive capacities for understanding syntax and grammar and abstract reference. The social intelligence that makes cooperation and communication valuable in the first place. All of these are biological givens that we bring to the process of building cities. Things that were there long before the first city walls were built. But we do not need to go that far back tonight. We have gone pretty far already, from the surface of a modern city, all the way back through its layers of infrastructure and governance, and social norms and accumulated knowledge. And what we find, when we follow those layers down, is that a city is not just a physical thing but a kind of crystallization of human cooperation over time. Every layer of it rests on another layer, and all of them together rest on the capacity of human beings to work together and to build on what previous generations have learned. There is something comforting about that, actually. The city we started with, the one with its lights on and its trains running and its bakery warming up for the morning, is not just a collection of systems. It is the result of an enormous amount of accumulated human effort and knowledge and cooperation. It is what happens when all of those layers are in place and working. Let's slow down now and just sit with one of those middle layers for a while, because there is a lot more to explore there. We touched on water and electricity as infrastructure layers, but there is another piece of infrastructure that is so fundamental, and so quietly important that it deserves its own extended conversation. That is the layer of food systems. The food system that sustains a modern city is, in a very real sense, invisible to most of the people who live in that city. You go to a grocery store and there are things on the shelves, arranged neatly, labeled with prices. You put things in a cart and pay for them and take them home and prepare them and eat them. The whole process, from your end of it, is quite simple and unremarkable. But the system behind it is anything but simple. The food in a grocery store in any large city comes from dozens or hundreds of different sources. The vegetables might come from farms in several different states or countries, depending on the season. The meat comes from animals raised at facilities that might be located far from the city and processed at other facilities even further. The packaged foods contain ingredients that might have traveled from even further, assembled into products at manufacturing plants, and then shipped to distribution centers and then to individual stores. Managing all of that, the sourcing and the processing and the shipping and the storage and the final distribution, is an enormous logistical operation. It is an operation that depends on the transportation infrastructure we already talked about, and on the communication and information systems that allow it to be coordinated. It also depends on a financial system that allows the payments to flow between all of the different participants, from the farmer who grew something to the distributor who moved it to the retailer who sold it. And it depends on a regulatory system that sets standards for food safety and labeling and handling, designed to make sure that what you buy in the store is actually what it says it is and is safe to eat. That regulatory layer is something that most people interact with only indirectly, in the form of labels and inspections and the quiet confidence that the food in the store will not make you sick. Before that was possible, before the global food supply chains and refrigerated transportation and modern food safety regulation, cities fed their populations differently. Local markets were more important, because the radius from which food could practically be brought was much smaller. Seasonal variation in what was available was much more pronounced. The relationship between a city's size and the agricultural capacity of its surrounding region was much more direct. An earlier stage of urban food supply is fascinating to think about, because it is so constrained compared to what we have now. A large medieval city, for instance, depended on an agricultural hinterland that extended only as far as it was practical to transport food without it spoiling, which in the absence of refrigeration and fast transportation was not very far. The city's population was therefore limited by what the surrounding farms could produce and what could be moved to market within a day or two by cart or boat. When bad harvests happened, as they did regularly, the consequences for urban populations could be severe. The supply chain was short enough that a drought or a blight in the surrounding region would mean real food shortages in the city within months. There was no practical way to quickly import food from somewhere far enough away that it had not been affected by the same conditions. Modern cities are largely insulated from this kind of local vulnerability, because their food comes from so many different and geographically dispersed sources. A drought in one region affects the supply of certain things but does not threaten the overall food supply, because other sources are available. But this resilience comes at the cost of a very long and complex supply chain that has its own vulnerabilities, which we do not need to dwell on tonight. The point is that the food system is one of the most fundamental layers of what sustains a city. Before any of the other things we have talked about, the water system and the electricity grid and the transportation network and the governance institutions, a city needs food. And the shape of the food system determines a great deal about the shape of the city itself. If we step back a little further into that food system, we find the farming that underlies it. Modern agriculture is itself a highly technical and infrastructure-dependent operation. Large-scale farms use sophisticated machinery, tractors and harvesters and irrigation systems that require fuel and parts and maintenance. They use fertilizers and pesticides, which are products of a chemical industry with its own complex supply chains. They depend on infrastructure like roads and electricity and communications. Modern agricultural productivity, the amount of food that can be grown per acre of land, is dramatically higher than it was even a century ago, because of advances in plant breeding, in soil science, in pest management, in irrigation. All of those advances represent accumulated knowledge that was developed through research and experimentation and refinement over many decades. And that knowledge rests on earlier knowledge. The plant breeding of the 20th century rested on the genetic theory developed in the 19th century by Mendel and others, which in turn rested on centuries of practical experience by farmers who had been selectively saving seeds from their best plants long before anyone understood the underlying mechanism. There is something beautiful about that deep continuity. The food on a modern city's shelves is the product of an unbroken chain of knowledge and practice that stretches back to the first farmers who figured out which wild plants could be cultivated and how to encourage their growth. The chain has been formalized and institutionalized and industrialized in various ways over that long period, but it has never broken. Each generation built on what the previous generation knew. At an earlier stage, before agriculture at all, human populations fed themselves by hunting and gathering, moving across the landscape to follow food sources through the seasons. That way of life could support only a relatively low density of people per unit of land, because the food available from wild sources can sustain only so many people. The transition to agriculture, wherever it happened, was what made higher population densities possible, and higher population densities are what made cities possible. So in a sense, the modern city is a consequence, a very distant consequence, of the invention of agriculture. That transition, which happened independently in several different parts of the world over the last 12 to 15,000 years, was one of the most significant shifts in human history. It changed not just how people got their food but how they organized their lives and communities and eventually their political structures and their ways of storing and transmitting knowledge. But again, we do not need to go all the way back there tonight. We are just noticing the layers, one by one, and how each one rests on another. Let's come back up from the very deep layers and spend some time on some of the layers that are closer to the surface, the ones that are more specifically urban in character. One of the most interesting of these is the layer that manages public health. Public health, in a city, is another one of those things that works so quietly, and so consistently that you mostly notice it only in its absence. The water coming out of your tap does not make you sick because the system is continuously testing and treating it. The food in the grocery store does not routinely cause illness because the system is setting and enforcing standards for how it is handled. The air in the city, while not perfect, is breathable in a way that it was not in many cities 150 years ago, because of regulations and technologies that have reduced emissions from factories and vehicles. All of that represents a layer of public health infrastructure that has been built up over a long time, mostly in response to the consequences of not having it. The history of public health in cities is in large part a history of crises, cholera outbreaks and typhoid fever and influenza pandemics, that revealed the vulnerabilities of dense urban populations to disease, and that prompted the development of systems to address those vulnerabilities. The connection between contaminated water and cholera, for instance, was not understood until the mid-19th century, when John Snow, a physician in London, traced an outbreak of cholera to a particular water pump in the neighborhood of Soho by mapping the cases and identifying the common source. Before that discovery, the prevailing theory was that disease spread through miasma, bad air, and the response to disease outbreaks was accordingly focused on things like improving ventilation and removing unpleasant smells. Once the connection between contaminated water and cholera was understood, the response was to build proper sewage systems that kept wastewater separated from drinking water supplies. That engineering response, building the infrastructure to prevent contamination, was enormously effective. Cholera essentially disappeared from cities that implemented proper sanitation systems. This pattern of understanding how disease spreads and then engineering the conditions that prevent that spread is the core of public health. And the engineering is often infrastructure engineering. Clean water systems and wastewater systems are public health infrastructure. Food inspection and regulation is public health infrastructure. Vaccination programs, which create population-level immunity to diseases that previously killed many people, are public health infrastructure. Even the building codes that require adequate light and ventilation in housing are, in part, public health infrastructure, developed in response to the observation that dense, poorly ventilated housing was associated with the spread of tuberculosis. Before that infrastructure was in place, urban living was considerably more dangerous to health than rural living. The density that made cities economically productive also made them effective environments for the spread of infectious disease. Cities in pre-industrial times had significantly higher death rates than the countryside and could only maintain their populations through continuous immigration from rural areas. The transformation of cities from net consumers of population to net producers of population, from places where people were dying faster than they were being born to places with positive natural population growth, was driven largely by improvements in public health infrastructure over the 19th and 20th centuries. Clean water, proper sanitation, vaccination, food safety regulation, housing improvements, all of these things together brought death rates down dramatically and extended average lifespans. If we step back a little further, we can see that the public health layer itself rests on a layer of medical and scientific knowledge. You cannot design an effective sewage system to prevent cholera until you understand how cholera spreads. You cannot develop a vaccine until you understand something about how the immune system works and how pathogens cause disease. The engineering solutions rest on the scientific understanding, which in turn rests on careful observation and experimentation and the slow accumulation of knowledge through the scientific process. And the scientific process, the practice of formulating hypotheses and testing them against evidence, and sharing results so that others can build on them, is itself a social practice with its own institutional infrastructure. Universities and research institutions and journals and conferences and funding agencies are all part of the system that produces and accumulates and distributes scientific knowledge. So the public health layer of a city rests on medical science, which rests on the scientific enterprise as a social institution, which rests on the educational systems and funding mechanisms and norms of scholarship that make it possible for science to function. Another deep chain of layers, all supporting each other. Let's shift and think about another layer that is quite specific to urban life. The layer that manages the flow of people through the city. This is the transportation layer as it applies to the city's internal movement, as distinct from the connections to the outside world that we talked about earlier. A large city has to move enormous numbers of people from where they sleep to where they work, and then back again, and between various destinations throughout the day. If all of those people tried to move at the same time in private vehicles, the system would seize up almost immediately. The roads would be completely blocked, nobody would be going anywhere, and the economic life of the city would grind to a halt. The solution that large cities have developed is public transit. Buses and subways and commuter trains and trams and various other forms of shared transportation that allow many people to move through the same corridor simultaneously, using far less space per person than private vehicles do. Public transit systems are, in themselves, layered systems with considerable complexity. There is the physical infrastructure, the tracks and tunnels and stations and platforms and the vehicles themselves. There is the operational system, the scheduling and dispatch and control systems that make the trains run on time or as close to it as possible. There is the maintenance system, the facilities and workers and parts and schedules that keep the vehicles and the infrastructure in working order. There is the ticketing and payment system. There is the information system, the signs and apps and announcements that tell riders when to expect the next train. All of these systems have to work together for the overall transit system to function well. A failure in any one of them can cascade through the others. If the maintenance system falls behind, vehicles break down more often, service becomes unreliable, ridership declines, fare revenue falls, maintenance budgets are cut, and the cycle continues. If the information system is poor, riders cannot effectively plan their journeys. They lose confidence in the system, and again ridership falls. The economic model of public transit is also interesting, because it illustrates some of the distinctive features of urban systems. Most transit systems do not cover their full costs through fares. They require public subsidy, because the fares that would be needed to cover costs would be high enough to price out many of the people who most need to use transit. The subsidy is justified on the grounds that transit provides broad public benefits. including reducing congestion for drivers and reducing emissions and making it possible for people without cars to access employment and services. This means that transit funding is a political question, not just an economic one. The level of service, the routes that are served, the fare structure, all of these are determined partly by technical analysis and partly by political decisions about priorities and trade-offs, which is another way in which the governance layer and the infrastructure layer are intertwined. Before that was possible, before subway systems and bus networks, cities moved their people differently. Horse-drawn streetcars were an important form of urban transit in many cities in the 19th century, before electric streetcars replaced them. Before streetcars, people walked, mostly, or rode in private carriages if they were wealthy enough. The radius within which a city could practically function was therefore limited by walking distance, which kept cities quite compact and dense by modern standards. The introduction of streetcars and then subway systems allowed cities to expand dramatically, because people could live further from their workplaces while still being able to get to work in a reasonable amount of time. The streetcar suburbs of the early 20th century, residential neighborhoods built along streetcar lines extending out from city centers, were a direct result of the expansion of transit infrastructure. At an earlier stage, the relationship between housing and employment in a city was very different. People generally had to live close to where they worked, because walking was the primary means of getting around. Artisans and shopkeepers often lived above or behind their workshops. Workers lived in dense housing near factories. The spatial organization of the city reflected the constraints of foot travel. The decoupling of where you live from where you work, which most urban residents now take for granted, is a relatively recent development made possible by transit infrastructure and later by the automobile. It has shaped the physical form of cities in profound ways, enabling the spread of suburbs and the emergence of the commuter culture that characterizes so many modern urban areas. If we step back a little further into the transit layer, we find the engineering knowledge required to build and operate transit systems. Subway tunnels require sophisticated civil engineering. The electrical systems that power electric trains require electrical engineering. The signaling systems that keep trains from colliding require both electrical engineering and computer science. The trains themselves are complex mechanical and electrical systems that require specialized expertise to design and maintain. All of that knowledge had to be developed and accumulated before the systems could be built. The first underground railways were built in the second half of the 19th century, and the engineers who built them were working at the frontier of what was technically possible at the time, solving problems as they went. Each subsequent subway system built on the knowledge gained from the previous ones, refining techniques and developing better solutions. The knowledge is now well established enough that building a subway system, while expensive and technically demanding, is not a frontier engineering challenge in the way it once was. The techniques are known, but the knowledge still has to be held by specific people and organizations, and if it were not transmitted and maintained, it would degrade over time. Let's shift again and think about another layer that is central to how a modern city functions but is somewhat less tangible than physical infrastructure. That is the layer of what we might call the professional services sector, the concentration of specialized expertise in a city that makes possible complex economic activity. A modern city is a place where many different kinds of specialized knowledge are clustered together in a relatively small area. There are lawyers who specialize in dozens of different areas of law. There are accountants and financial advisors and bankers. There are engineers of many different kinds. There are doctors and dentists and various other medical specialists. There are architects and urban planners. There are research scientists. There are managers and consultants and people who do many kinds of work that require specific training and expertise. The clustering of this expertise in cities is not accidental. It reflects the economic logic of what economists call agglomeration, the tendency for skilled workers and the firms that employ them to cluster together because being near other skilled workers and firms creates opportunities and efficiencies. A lawyer who specializes in a narrow area of corporate law is more useful and can charge more in a city with a large concentration of corporate activity than they would be in a small town. A doctor who specializes in a rare condition can build a patient base only in a place large enough to have enough patients. This clustering of expertise is one of the most fundamental features of cities as economic institutions. Cities are, in a very deep sense, places where knowledge and expertise concentrate. The knowledge lives in the people who live and work in the city, and it is accessible to others in the city because of the physical proximity and the density of interaction that the city provides. Before that was possible, before the development of specialized professional roles and the concentration, the development of professions and the codification of professional knowledge, and the creation of professional training institutions, law schools and medical schools and engineering schools, was both a cause and a consequence of urban growth. Cities created the markets that justified specialization. Specialization made cities more productive. Productivity made cities attractive to more people and more activity. And so the cycle continued. If we step back a little further, we can see that the professional services layer rests on the educational layer in a direct way. Lawyers are lawyers because they attended law school. Doctors are doctors because they attended medical school. Engineers are engineers because they attended engineering school. All of these professional training institutions exist in cities or near them, partly because cities provide the internship and practical training opportunities that are part of professional education, and partly because the graduates want to work in cities. There is also a layer of professional infrastructure, beyond the formal training, that allows professionals to function effectively. There are professional associations that set standards and provide continuing education. There are regulatory bodies that license practitioners and discipline those who violate professional standards. There are information resources, journals and databases and case law that professionals use to stay current and to do their work. All of these are institutional arrangements that support the professional layer of the city. Let's think now about another layer that is in some ways the most intimate and most human of all the ones we have discussed. That is the layer of social networks and community. A city is not just a collection of systems. It is a collection of people, and people are social creatures who live their lives through relationships. In any given city, At any given moment, there are friendships being formed and maintained, families gathering for dinner, neighbors exchanging greetings in hallways, colleagues sharing lunch, strangers striking up conversations. All of that human connection and warmth and texture is happening alongside and within and because of all the systems we have been describing. Social networks in a city perform functions that are both personal and economic. People find jobs through social networks. They find housing. They find partners. They find communities of shared interest and belief. They provide and receive help in times of difficulty. They share information about what is good in the neighborhood, the best bakery, the most trustworthy plumber. In a city, social networks span an enormous range. There are the tight-knit networks of close friends and family that most people have, the people they would call in a crisis. There are the looser networks of acquaintances and colleagues, people they know and interact with regularly but less intensely. And there are the even looser networks of shared community, the sense of belonging to a neighborhood, or a cultural group, or a professional community. All of these networks exist within the physical space of the city, but they are not determined by that physical space. People in the same building may have very little connection to each other, while people across the city who share an interest or a background may be closely connected. The city creates the possibility of these connections by bringing large numbers of people into a shared space. But whether and how those connections form depends on the choices and circumstances of the individual people involved. The social layer of a city is also important for the functioning of the other layers. Social networks help economic systems work better by providing information and reducing the uncertainty involved in transactions. They help governance work better by creating civic engagement and accountability. They help public health work better by enabling the spread of health information and the mobilization of community resources in times of need. Before that was possible, before cities brought large numbers of people into close proximity, social networks were necessarily smaller and more localized. A person's network extended roughly as far as they could practically travel on a regular basis. The range of people they could know was limited by geography. The city, by concentrating people in a small area, dramatically expanded the potential range of social connection. You could know people from many different backgrounds and walks of life, with many different experiences and perspectives. That diversity of social connection is itself a resource, one that cities have generated in ways that more dispersed settlement patterns could not. At an earlier stage, before urbanization had proceeded as far as it now has, human social life was conducted in smaller communities where everyone knew everyone. Those communities had their own strengths, including tighter social bonds and stronger mutual obligations. But they also had limitations, including the difficulty of encountering new ideas and the limited range of possibilities available to any individual. The city opened up possibilities in ways that small-scale communities could not. The anonymity of the city, which can feel like a loss compared to the tight community of a village, also created freedoms. People could reinvent themselves in a city in ways that were harder in a place where everyone knew your history. People could pursue unusual interests and find others who shared them. people could escape constraining social expectations and try new ways of living. Those freedoms, as much as the economic opportunities, have been a major driver of migration to cities throughout history. People have moved to cities not just to find work but to find community, to find others like themselves, to find new possibilities. Let's come back to the physical layer now and look at something we have not yet spent much time on, which is the layer of housing. Housing is one of the most fundamental and most contested issues in any city. People need places to live, and the city has to provide them. How it provides them, who gets access to what kind of housing, how housing is produced and maintained and regulated, these are questions that run through the heart of urban life. The housing stock of a city represents an enormous accumulated investment. The buildings in a city were built over many different periods, and older ones reflect the construction methods and materials and standards of the times when they were built. In many cities, there are buildings that are 100 or more years old still in daily use as residences. They have been maintained and in many cases modified over the years, but they are still standing because they were built solidly enough to last. The maintenance of the housing stock is a continuous process. Buildings age, components wear out. Systems need to be updated. Without maintenance, a building deteriorates over time, and a deteriorating building eventually becomes uninhabitable. The rate at which the housing stock deteriorates, and the rate at which it is maintained and improved determines whether the overall supply of habitable housing in a city grows or shrinks. That rate of maintenance depends on a number of factors, including the financial resources available to property owners, the regulatory environment that sets minimum standards and requires certain kinds of maintenance, and the availability of the materials and skilled workers needed to do maintenance work. When any of these factors is constrained, maintenance falls behind, and the housing stock degrades. New housing is also continuously being added to cities, as population grows and as the demand for different kinds of housing changes over time. Building new housing requires land, which in a dense city is often expensive and sometimes scarce. It requires financing, which depends on the financial system we discussed earlier. It requires approval processes and building permits, which are part of the governance system. And it requires the construction industry, which is itself a complex system of contractors and subcontractors and materials suppliers and skilled tradespeople. The relationship between housing supply and housing cost is one of the most contentious issues in urban policy. When housing supply does not keep up with demand, prices rise, and housing becomes less affordable for many people. The consequences of that can be severe, including long commutes as people move far from their workplaces in search of affordable housing, displacement of existing residents, homelessness, and restricted economic mobility as housing costs take up a larger share of household budgets. Before that was possible, before the development of real estate markets and mortgage finance and zoning regulations and building codes, housing was produced and distributed very differently. In most of human history, housing was largely self-built or built by local craftspeople using locally available materials. The relationship between producer and user was much more direct and personal. There was no real estate market in the modern sense, no complex chain of actors between the person who needed housing and the person who provided it. As cities grew and as the capitalist economy developed, housing became increasingly a commodity, something produced for sale or rent in the market. That transformation had profound consequences for how housing was distributed and what quality it was. Market production of housing could be very responsive to effective demand, meaning it could produce a lot of housing quickly when people with money to spend wanted housing. But it was much less responsive to the need for housing among people who lacked the money to express their preferences in the market. The result, in many rapidly growing industrial cities, was severe housing deprivation among working-class populations. Dense, overcrowded, poorly built housing with inadequate light and ventilation and sanitation was the norm for much of the urban working class in the 19th century. The public health consequences were serious, as we have discussed, and the conditions of urban housing were a major concern of social reformers throughout that period, driving the development of housing codes and public housing programs and other interventions. At an earlier stage, before the industrial city, housing in cities was also often crowded and poor quality, but the nature of the problem was somewhat different. The pre-industrial city was dense partly because of the constraints of foot travel we discussed. Buildings were built close together to minimize the distances people had to walk. Upper floors of buildings were added as populations grew and land became more valuable. The street grid was often narrow and irregular, following earlier patterns of land division. The physical form of the pre-industrial city, which we can still see in the preserved historic centers of many European cities, reflects those constraints and those patterns. It has a human scale because it was built for people on foot. It has a density and a variety and an irregularity that many people find appealing, precisely because it was not planned from above but grew organically from the choices of many individual owners and builders over long periods. Modern cities have a different character, partly because the technology of movement, cars and transit, has changed the constraints on urban form. Wide streets for traffic, parking garages, setbacks between buildings and streets. All of these are features of the automobile city that look very different from the walking city. And the large-scale development projects that built much of the housing stock in 20th century cities often had a uniformity and a scale that reflected the production efficiencies of building many units at once rather than the accumulated choices of many individual builders. If we step back a little further and think about what underlies the housing layer, we find again the layers of construction knowledge and materials and labor and finance that we have visited in other contexts. But there is also something more specific to housing, which is the question of how land is allocated and used. Land in a city is finite. There is only so much of it, at least within the borders of the city. And the choices about how to use each piece of it, what to build and what not to build, how tall buildings can be and how many units they can contain, where different kinds of uses are permitted, have enormous consequences for the shape and character and affordability and livability of the city. Those choices are made through the zoning and planning systems that most modern cities have developed. Zoning systems divide the city into different districts with different rules about what can be built there. planning systems set longer-term visions for how the city should develop and create frameworks for guiding development decisions. These systems are themselves products of the governance layer, developed in response to the consequences of unregulated development, and maintained by the political processes of city government. They represent one of the most powerful ways in which governance shapes the physical form of the city. The history of zoning is a complex one, including both legitimate concerns about separating incompatible uses, like keeping heavy industry away from residential neighborhoods, and less legitimate uses, like excluding affordable housing or racial and ethnic minorities from desirable neighborhoods. Understanding that history, with all of its complexity, is part of understanding how the cities we have now came to look and function the way they do. Before zoning was possible, before cities had developed those formal systems of land use regulation, development was guided by other mechanisms. Private deed restrictions attached conditions to land sales. Common law nuisance rules provided some protection against particularly harmful uses. Market forces sorted uses to some extent, as industrial uses bid up land values in some areas and residential uses in others. But in the rapidly growing industrial cities of the 19th century, those mechanisms were often insufficient. The pace of growth was too fast and the pressures too intense for informal or common law mechanisms to provide adequate guidance. The result was a chaotic mixing of uses and a general degradation of urban environments that provided much of the impetus for the development of more formal planning and regulation. If we step back a little further from the planning layer, we find the intellectual tradition of urban planning itself. The ideas that planners use, the theories about how cities should be organized and what makes for good urban environments, have developed over a long time through the contributions of many thinkers and practitioners. Some of those ideas have been enormously influential. The idea of the garden city, developed by Ebenezer Howard at the end of the 19th century, envisioned planned communities that combined the best features of city and countryside, with housing and industry and green space laid out in a deliberate way. Garden city ideas influenced the development of new towns in Britain and elsewhere, and left a mark on suburban development patterns more broadly. The ideas associated with the International Congress of Modern Architecture in the early and middle 20th century shaped the large-scale urban renewal and public housing projects that transformed many cities in that era. Those ideas emphasized rationalism and functionalism, the separation of uses, the tower in the park, wide streets for cars. The results were often criticized by later observers for destroying the street life and community that older urban neighborhoods had, even when those neighborhoods were impoverished and physically deteriorated. Later urban thinkers, like Jane Jacobs, whose book The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961, became enormously influential, pushed back against the rationalist planning tradition. Jacobs emphasized the complexity and the emergent character of urban life, arguing that good cities came from the mix of old and new buildings and different uses and lots of people on the street, not from large-scale planned interventions. These intellectual debates about what cities should be and how they should be planned are not just academic. They have practical consequences for how cities are built and how they function. The ideas that planners and politicians hold about what good urban form looks like shape the decisions they make, which in turn shape the cities that people actually live in. And those decisions accumulate over time. The city that exists today is the result of decisions made not just now but over decades and in some cases centuries. The street grid laid out 100 years ago still structures how people move through the city today. The buildings constructed 50 years ago still house people and businesses today. The zoning decisions made 20 years ago still affect what can be built and where. Cities are, in this sense, very long-lived things. They carry their history in their physical form in a way that is quite visible once you know how to look. The old neighborhoods and the new ones, the wide boulevards and the narrow streets, the high-rise towers and the low-scale row houses, all of them tell stories about different moments in the city's development, and about the ideas and constraints and resources that were operative at those moments. Let's think now about one more layer, one that we have gestured at several times, but have not looked at directly. That is the layer of energy. We talked about the electrical grid as a piece of infrastructure. But energy in a city is broader than electricity. It includes the natural gas that heats many homes and powers many stoves. It includes the gasoline and diesel that fuel most private vehicles and many commercial vehicles. It includes the energy embodied in the food that people eat, which is ultimately solar energy captured by plants through photosynthesis. And it includes the thermal energy stored in buildings, the warmth that accumulates from heating systems and from occupants and from sunlight. Modern cities are enormous consumers of energy. The density of economic activity and human activity that makes cities so productive and so vibrant also makes them very energy intensive. Heating and cooling buildings, powering elevators and lighting and appliances, running the transportation systems, operating the industries and businesses and institutions that give the city its economic character. All of this requires vast amounts of energy continuously. That energy has to come from somewhere. For most of the history of the modern industrial city, it has come primarily from fossil fuels, coal and then oil and natural gas. Fossil fuels are energy-dense, relatively easy to transport, and until recently relatively cheap, which is why they came to dominate the energy systems of cities and of industrial civilization more broadly. Before fossil fuels were possible, cities used different energy sources. Wood was the primary fuel for heating and cooking throughout most of human history, supplemented by animal fat and later by coal in places where it was available. Water power, from mills on rivers and streams, was an important energy source for manufacturing before steam power arrived. The transition to fossil fuels, beginning in the 18th century with the widespread use of coal for industrial production and then expanding through the 19th and 20th centuries as oil and gas came into use, enabled a dramatic expansion of energy consumption and of everything that energy consumption made possible. It powered the Industrial Revolution and the urban growth that accompanied it. It made possible the transportation systems and the manufacturing systems and the agricultural systems that sustain the modern city. Now, in the early 21st century, cities and the broader energy system are in the early stages of another transition, away from fossil fuels and toward renewable energy sources, primarily solar and wind. That transition is driven partly by the environmental consequences of burning fossil fuels and partly by the falling cost of renewable technologies, which has made them increasingly competitive with fossil fuels on purely economic terms. This transition is affecting cities in a variety of ways, from the installation of solar panels on rooftops and in parking lots to the electrification of transit fleets to changes in building codes that require or incentivize better energy efficiency. The shape of the energy system is changing, and with it the shape of the infrastructure that cities depend on. But the deepest layer of urban energy, the one that underlies all the others, is the relationship between energy and human effort. What energy does, fundamentally, is allow work to be done without requiring human muscle power. A car engine burning gasoline does work that would otherwise require many horses or many people. An electric motor running an elevator does work that would otherwise require many people climbing stairs. A gas furnace heating a building does work that would otherwise require many people gathering and burning wood or other fuel. Energy, in this sense, is what allows cities to be as large and as productive as they are. The scale of a modern city would be impossible if all of the work it required had to be done by human and animal muscle alone. Energy is what allows the ratio of economically productive activity to raw physical labor to be as high as it is. That ratio is one of the most fundamental things that has changed in human history over the last 2.5 centuries. Before the Industrial Revolution, most economic output required commensurate human labor. After it, the application of mechanical energy, first from steam and then from electricity and internal combustion engines, allowed the same amount of labor to produce vastly more output. That shift is what we mean when we talk about economic growth in a deep sense. Not just more activity, but more activity per unit of human effort. Cities concentrate and leverage that shift. By bringing many people and many forms of capital and knowledge together in a small area, they make the application of energy and technology more productive. The skyscraper is possible because of the elevator, which is possible because of the electric motor, which is possible because of the electrical grid. The density of the skyscraper district makes the city more economically productive. The economic productivity justifies the investment in the infrastructure that makes it possible. Another one of those interlocking circles. If we go back even further into the energy story, we arrive at the solar energy that powers the entire system. Fossil fuels are, in a sense, stored solar energy, sunlight that was captured by plants millions of years ago and stored in organic matter that became buried and eventually transformed into coal and oil and gas. Wind and moving water, the energy sources of earlier eras, are also driven ultimately by the sun, as is the growth of the plants and animals that people eat. Even nuclear energy, which draws on the binding energy in atomic nuclei, was formed in earlier stars and delivered to Earth in the matter that makes up the planet. All of the energy systems that cities depend on are, in the deepest sense, drawing on the work that the sun does. The sun is the ultimate source of the energy that powers human civilization, which makes it, in a quiet and indirect way, the ultimate foundation of the city. There is something nice about arriving at that image. The city, with all its complexity, all its layers of infrastructure and governance and knowledge and social life, is ultimately a way of organizing human beings to take advantage of the flow of energy from the sun and to apply that energy to human purposes with increasing efficiency and effectiveness over time. Every layer we have looked at tonight, the water systems and the electrical grids and the transportation networks and the governance institutions and the educational systems and the social networks and the housing and the food systems and all the rest, is part of that project. The project of organizing human life in a way that allows people to meet their needs and pursue their possibilities, drawing on the resources that the physical world provides and the knowledge that human ingenuity has accumulated. Cities are the most concentrated and intensive version of that project that humanity has developed so far. They are places where the density of human activity and the complexity of human cooperation reach their highest levels. And they are, as we have seen tonight, extraordinarily fragile in certain ways and extraordinarily resilient in others. Fragile because each layer depends on the others, and a failure in any one of them creates stresses that propagate through the rest. Resilient because the depth of the investment in those layers, the buildings and the pipes and the cables and the knowledge and the institutions and the social bonds, means that they do not fail quickly or easily. Cities have absorbed enormous shocks throughout history, wars and plagues and earthquakes and fires, and they have survived and rebuilt because the accumulated investment was deep enough and the human capacity to cooperate and reconstruct was strong enough. The city that exists right now, the one with its lights on and its trains running and its bakery warming up for the morning, is the product of all of that accumulated investment, and all of that accumulated knowledge and all of that ongoing human effort and cooperation. It is a remarkable thing, when you slow down and really look at it. Not a dramatic or exciting thing, necessarily, but remarkable in the quiet way that very deep things often are. And as you drift towards sleep now, you might just hold that image for a moment. The city running quietly in the background, the water flowing through pipes under the streets, the grid humming at the frequency it always hums at, the trains making their last runs of the night, the maintenance crews at work somewhere, fixing something that most people will never notice, the bakery with its ovens warming up, getting ready to produce bread that will be eaten tomorrow morning by people who will never know who baked it. All of it working together, layer on layer, each one resting on another, the whole thing a kind of slow miracle of cooperation that has taken a very long time to build and that continues, quietly, all the way through the night.